Sometimes the cheapest things in life cost us everything we hold dear. The Blackwood cabin sat like a broken tooth against the Oregon mountainside, its windows black as coal, its foundations sinking into earth that hadn't known sunlight in decades. Elena Vasquez clutched the rusted key in her palm, feeling the metal bite into her skin as she stared at what $1 had bought her, a roof over her head and possibly a grave beneath her feet. She'd lost everything else to her mother's medical bills, the house, the car, even her nursing job when exhaustion made her hands shake during medication rounds. But Elena had learned something profound during those long nights in hospital corridors. Sometimes the dying aren't the ones who need saving most. The cabin door opened with a sound like breaking bones, and that's when she saw him. Dorian stood in the shadows of the main room, pale as moonlight, beautiful as a Renaissance statue, and absolutely, impossibly still. No breath, no heartbeat, no life, yet his dark eyes held centuries of longing. "I've been waiting for you," he whispered, and Elena realized she hadn't stumbled into shelter. She'd walked into destiny. But what happens when the person you're meant to save might destroy the world to keep you? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Elena's breath caught in her throat, the rusted key falling from her nerveless fingers to clatter against the warped floorboards. The sound echoed through the cabin like a gunshot, but Dorian didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. "That's impossible," she whispered, though her voice carried no conviction. After watching 47 patients slip away into whatever waited beyond, Elena had learned to recognize death. This man, if he was a man, wore it like a second skin. Dorian tilted his head, the movement fluid yet somehow wrong, like watching a predator assess prey. "Many things are impossible, Lena. Yet here you stand in a cabin that shouldn't exist, speaking to someone who died 3 centuries ago." The casual use of her name sent ice racing down her spine. "How do you know your name?" His lips curved into something that might have been a smile if it had reached his eyes. "I know many things about you. Elena Marie Vasquez, 34, born in Sacramento to Maria Elena Vasquez. May she rest in peace. You've spent the last 3 years watching your mother die by degrees, selling pieces of your life to buy her moments of comfort. A noble cause that left you with nothing but debt and exhaustion." Elena's hand found the doorframe, splinters biting into her palm as she fought the urge to flee. But where would she run? The bank had already foreclosed on everything she'd ever called home. This broken-down cabin in the middle of nowhere was all she had left. "The real estate agent said this place was empty," she managed, forcing her voice steady. Years of speaking to frightened patients had taught her the power of calm authority, even when her own world was crumbling. "Agent Morrison?" Dorian moved then, not walking but gliding across the room with impossible grace. "Poor man thinks he's been having vivid dreams about this property. I encourage such misconceptions. It keeps the curious away." The October mist pressed against the windows like grasping fingers, and Elena noticed for the first time how the shadows seemed to bend toward him, as if even darkness sought his company. Her rational mind, the mind that had memorized drug interactions and memorized symptoms, screamed that she should run. But beneath that clinical training lay something deeper, the instinct that had drawn her to nursing, the ability to see suffering and step toward it, rather than away. "You're hurt," she said, the words surprising them both. Dorian went perfectly still, which should have been impossible since he hadn't been moving to begin with. "I beg your pardon. In pain. I can see it." Elena took a tentative step forward, her nursing instincts overriding her terror. "The way you hold yourself, like breathing, hurts. The tension around your eyes. I've seen it in terminal patients who've given up hope." Something flickered across his face, surprise, perhaps, or something more dangerous. "You see pain in a dead man? I see pain in everyone." The admission slipped out before she could stop it, carrying 3 years of grief and exhaustion. "It's what I do, what I am." I help people who are dying. And if I told you I've been dying for 300 years? Elena studied his face in the dim light filtering through grimy windows. Classical features that belonged in a museum, skin like carved marble, and eyes that held the weight of centuries. Everything about him screamed danger, yet something in those ancient eyes called to the part of her that had spent countless nights holding strangers' hands as they faced the dark. Then I'd say 300 years is long enough for anyone to suffer. The words hung between them like a bridge neither had expected to build. Outside, the mist thickened, pressing against the cabin as if the very mountains were holding their breath. Dorian laughed, but the sound held no humor. "Do you know what you've done by coming here, Elena Vasquez? Bought the only property I could afford with my last dollar? You've walked into a fairy tale, the kind where the princess doesn't live happily ever after." He gestured to the shadows that seemed to pulse with their own life. "I am bound to this place by forces older than your country, held here by a curse that requires specific conditions to break." Elena's mouth went dry. What kind of conditions? The willing sacrifice of someone pure of heart, someone who would choose to save a monster. His eyes met hers, and she saw hunger there, not for blood, though that lurked beneath the surface, but for something far more dangerous. Hope. Someone exactly like you. The cabin creaked around them, settling deeper into the earth as if the very foundation were shifting. Elena realized with crystalline clarity that she stood at a crossroads that would define not just her future, but possibly the world's. Behind her lay bankruptcy, loneliness, and the slow death of dreams deferred. Ahead waited mystery, danger, and something that might be destiny. She bent down and picked up the rusted key. "Tell me about the curse," she said. Dorian regarded the key in her hand with an expression Elena couldn't quite read. Something between reverence and revulsion, as if the simple piece of rusted metal held both salvation and damnation. "The curse," he repeated, his voice carrying the weight of centuries. "Where does one begin with 300 years of captivity?" Elena remained standing, the key warm against her palm despite its obvious age. Part of her recognized the surreal nature of this conversation, a bankrupt nurse discussing ancient curses with a self-proclaimed vampire in a cabin she'd bought for $1. Yet it felt no more impossible than the past 3 years had been, watching her vibrant mother fade into a shadow of herself while medical bills devoured Elena's future one treatment at a time. "Begin with why you're here," she said, falling back on the gentle interrogation techniques she'd learned for difficult patients. "Who did this to you?" Dorian moved to the cracked window, his reflection notably absent in the grimy glass. Her name was Isadora Thorne, and she was the most powerful witch of her generation. Also, unfortunately, the woman I betrayed for another's love. The casual admission hung in the air like smoke. Elena found herself studying his profile, the sharp line of his jaw, the way shadows seemed to cling to him like old friends. "Hell hath no fury." Indeed. His fingers traced patterns on the window frame, and Elena noticed how the wood seemed to darken at his touch. "Isadora bound me here with blood magic and heartbreak, ensuring I would remain trapped until someone came who embodied everything I had thrown away: compassion, selflessness, the ability to love without reservation." "And you think that's me?" Elena almost laughed, but the sound caught in her throat. After 3 years of watching her dreams crumble while she fought a losing battle against cancer, she felt anything but pure of heart. Some nights she'd caught herself resenting her mother's illness, hating the way it had consumed everything Elena had worked for. The guilt of those moments still poisoned her sleep. The curse recognizes truth, even when we cannot see it ourselves. Dorian turned back to her, and his eyes seemed to hold starlight. "You sacrificed your career, your home, your future for someone you loved. Even now, facing homelessness and bankruptcy, your first instinct was to ease a stranger's suffering." Elena's throat tightened. "I failed. She died anyway, and I lost everything for nothing. You stayed. Until the very end. You stayed." His voice carried an ache that spoke of profound loneliness. "Do you know how rare that is? How precious?" The question stirred something dangerous in Elena's chest, a longing she'd buried beneath practical concerns and devastating grief. When had anyone last seen her sacrifices as precious rather than foolish? Her ex-fiancé David had left 18 months into her mother's treatment, claiming he couldn't watch Elena throw her life away on false hope. Her few remaining friends had grown tired of cancelled plans and conversations that inevitably circled back to medical updates and mounting bills. "The curse requires willing sacrifice," Dorian continued, his gaze never leaving her face. "Not coercion, not trickery, but a conscious choice to save someone undeserving of salvation. And if I refuse, then you have purchased a cabin with excellent privacy and questionable plumbing. I remain bound, you remain alone, and the world continues as it always has." Elena studied the key in her palm, noting how its weight seemed far greater than rust and iron should account for. "And if I agree?" Dorian's expression grew carefully neutral, but she caught a flicker of something desperate in his eyes before he shuttered it away. "Then you would learn why Isadora considered my freedom a fate worse than death itself." The admission should have terrified her. Instead, Elena found herself thinking of her mother's final words, whispered through morphine haze. "Don't let my dying be the end of your living, Mija." At the time, Elena had assumed it meant moving on, finding a way to rebuild. Now she wondered if it meant something more dangerous, choosing to step forward into the unknown rather than merely surviving. "I need time to think," she said finally. Dorian inclined his head with old-world courtesy. "Time is the one thing I have in abundance, though I should warn you, the longer you remain here, the more the mountain's influence will affect you. This place exists between worlds, Elena. Extended exposure to its energies can change someone. Change them how? You'll find yourself seeing things differently, feeling things more intensely. The barriers between possible and impossible grow thin." His smile held genuine warmth for the first time since she'd arrived. Some might call it magic. Others would call it madness. Elena pocketed the key, its weight settling against her hip like a promise. "Right now, I'm not sure there's much difference." As if summoned by her words, the October mist pressed closer to the windows, and somewhere in its swirling depths, Elena could have sworn she heard whispers calling her name. The whispers grew louder. Elena pressed her palms against her ears, but the voices seemed to originate from inside her skull rather than the mist beyond the windows. They spoke in languages she didn't recognize, yet somehow understood. Words of warning, of hunger, of ancient promises made in blood and starlight. "Elena!" Dorian's voice cut through the cacophony like a blade, instantly silencing the chorus. "Don't listen to them. What are they saying?" Her hands trembled as she lowered them, the phantom voices still echoing in the space between her thoughts. "Nothing you need to hear. Not yet." His jaw tightened. "The mountain remembers every soul that's died upon its slopes. They're drawn to those who stand at crossroads, eager to influence the living toward particular choices." Before Elena could respond, a sharp rap echoed through the cabin. 3 measured knocks against the front door, precise and somehow wrong in the heavy silence of the mist-shrouded afternoon. Dorian went rigid, his nostrils flaring like a predator scenting danger. "That's impossible." Elena moved toward the door, but his hand shot out, catching her wrist with inhuman speed. His skin was winter cold against hers. "No one comes to this place. The mountain's influences ensure it. Agent Morrison forgets the location the moment he leaves. Delivery drivers find themselves inexplicably lost. Even emergency services cannot locate the cabin unless—" He released her, backing toward the shadows, as understanding dawned in his ancient eyes. "Unless they're invited by blood." The knocking came again, more insistent now. Through the grimy windows, Elena could make out a figure in the mist, tall, draped in dark clothing, perfectly still despite the wind that set the pine trees swaying. "Someone's looking for me," Elena realized, her stomach dropping. "The bank. They must have traced the property purchase, sent someone to—" "Look at me, Elena." Dorian's command carried a weight that compelled obedience. When her eyes met his, she saw fear there, genuine, bone-deep terror that made her breath catch. "What have you done in the past week? Who have you spoken to about coming here?" "No one. I didn't tell anyone where I was going because—" She swallowed hard. "Because there's no one left to tell." The third knock rattled the door in its frame, accompanied by a voice that made Elena's blood freeze. "Elena Marie Vasquez, we know you're inside." The speaker was a woman, her tone cultured and precise, carrying an authority that made Elena's nursing instincts scream warnings. She'd heard voices like that before. Doctors who delivered terminal diagnoses without flinching, administrators who discussed human lives like budget line items. "How do they know my full name?" Elena whispered. Dorian had melted into the shadows near the fireplace, his form wavering at the edges as if he were becoming one with the darkness. "There are others who have been watching this place, waiting for someone like you to arrive." "Others?" Isadora Thorne had colleagues. Those who believed my imprisonment was insufficient punishment for my crimes. His voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. They would see me destroyed entirely rather than risk my eventual freedom. The door handle rattled, and Elena heard the distinct sound of metal tools working against the lock. Professional tools, wielded by someone with experience. "Elena," the voice called again, closer now, as if the speaker had pressed her mouth to the wooden panels. "We can help you. You don't understand what you've stumbled into, but it's not too late. Open the door." Something in those words, their honeyed reasonableness, their promise of rescue, made Elena's skin crawl. She'd heard similar platitudes from well-meaning social workers and grief counselors, people who thought they understood her situation but only saw its surface. "Don't!" Dorian's voice emerged from the shadows, urgent. "Whatever they're offering, whatever they promise, they cannot see you as anything more than a complication to be managed." The lock clicked open. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs as she faced a choice that would define everything that came after. She could run to the door, throw it open, and accept whatever salvation these strangers offered. Return to the ordinary world of debt and loneliness, but at least a world that made sense. Or she could step deeper into the shadows where Dorian waited, choosing mystery over safety, the unknown over the merely difficult. The door began to swing open, revealing a woman in an expensive charcoal coat, her silver hair pinned in a severe chignon. Behind her stood two men in dark suits, their eyes scanning the cabin's interior with predatory efficiency. "There you are, dear," the woman said, her smile sharp as winter moonlight. "My name is Victoria Ashford. I represent certain interests that have a stake in this property." Elena's hand found the key in her pocket, its metal now burning hot against her palm. "I'm sorry," she heard herself say, surprising everyone in the room, including herself. "But I'm not interested in whatever you're selling." She stepped backward into Dorian's waiting shadows. Victoria Ashford's smile never wavered, but something predatory flickered behind her steel-grey eyes. "Oh, my dear girl, you misunderstand. We're not here to sell you anything." She stepped across the threshold uninvited, her expensive heels clicking against the warped floorboards with metronomic precision. "We're here to save your life." Elena's back pressed against the cold stone of the fireplace, the shadows seeming to embrace her like protective arms. Where was Dorian? She could feel his presence, a whisper of winter air, a sense of barely leashed power, but he had vanished completely from sight. "I don't need saving," Elena managed, though her voice betrayed the lie. After 3 years of drowning in medical debt and grief, salvation was exactly what she'd been seeking when she'd driven up this mountain with her last dollar and a property deed that felt like a fever dream. "Don't you?" Victoria's gaze swept the cabin's decrepit interior, the water-stained walls, the broken windows, the floorboards that sagged ominously with each step, a hospice nurse with crushing debt, buying property sight unseen from a man who's been legally dead for 15 years. Agent Morrison was quite helpful once we explained the situation. The casual mention of Morrison's cooperation sent ice racing down Elena's spine. What had these people done to the bumbling real estate agent who'd seemed so eager to unload this property? Poor Mr. Morrison suffers from such vivid dreams, Victoria continued, echoing Dorian's earlier words with unsettling accuracy. Amazing what the human mind will accept as reality when properly encouraged. One of the men behind Victoria moved to the window, his pale eyes scanning the mist-shrouded forest beyond. He was young, Elena realized, perhaps mid-20s, but something in his posture spoke of violence held barely in check. "The wards are weakening," he said without turning around. "The boundary stones are failing." "Of course they are." Victoria's attention never left Elena's face. 300 years is a long time for any binding to hold, especially one powered by emotion rather than proper ritual. Heartbreak fades, you see. Even magical heartbreak. Elena's grip tightened on the key, its metal now burning so hot she half expected her skin to blister. "I don't know what you're talking about." Dorian Blackwood. Victoria spoke the name like an incantation, and Elena felt the shadows around her recoil. Born 1695, died 1723, cursed to eternal imprisonment for crimes that would turn your stomach. Though I suspect you find him rather charming, don't you? He always was gifted at presenting his best face to potential victims. He's not. Elena caught herself before she could reveal how much she'd already learned. But Victoria's knowing smile suggested the damage was done. "Not what, dear? Not dangerous? Not a killer?" Victoria reached into her coat and withdrew something that made Elena's breath catch. A leather journal, its pages yellow with age. "Shall I read you some excerpts from Isadora Thorne's research notes? The body count is quite impressive, actually. 17 confirmed victims in London alone before he fled to the New World." The words hit Elena like physical blows. 17 people. 17 families destroyed. 17 lives cut short. She thought of her mother's final weeks, how desperately Elena had fought for every additional day, every small comfort. The idea of someone casually ending 17 lives made her stomach turn. "I can see that troubles you," Victoria observed with false sympathy. "As well it should. You're a healer, Elena. You dedicate your life to preserving human dignity in the face of death. What would you do with a creature that feeds on suffering, that finds ecstasy in the moment a soul departs its mortal shell?" Elena pressed deeper into the shadows, her rational mind warring with something she couldn't name. The woman's words made perfect sense. Elena had seen enough death to know its value, had fought too hard for her mother's life to take murder lightly. Yet something about Victoria's presentation felt wrong, too polished, too rehearsed, like a closing argument designed to manipulate rather than inform. "The curse is breaking," the second man spoke for the first time, his voice carrying a slight accent Elena couldn't place. "The key burns in her pocket. She's already chosen." "No." The word escaped Elena's lips before she could stop it. "I haven't chosen anything. I don't even understand what's happening." Victoria's expression softened into something almost maternal. "Of course you don't, poor thing. You thought you were buying a home, didn't you? Somewhere to start over, to heal from your devastating loss." She took another step forward, close enough now that Elena could smell her perfume, something expensive and cloying that reminded her of funeral flowers. "Instead, you've stumbled into a nightmare centuries in the making." The key in Elena's pocket pulsed like a second heartbeat, and for a moment, she could have sworn she heard Dorian's voice whispering her name. But when she looked around the cabin, she saw only Victoria and her companions, their faces filled with the kind of practiced concern that reminded her uncomfortably of her mother's oncologists. "Let us help you," Victoria said, extending a manicured hand. "Before you make a choice you can never unmake." Elena stared at Victoria's outstretched hand, its manicured perfection a stark contrast to her own work-worn fingers. The offer hung between them like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. Safety, understanding, a return to the rational world she'd known before keys burned like brands and shadows whispered impossible truths. "What kind of help?" Elena asked, though part of her already knew she wouldn't like the answer. "Extraction," the younger man said bluntly, earning a sharp look from Victoria. "Clean containment protocols. Memory adjustment. You'll wake up in a Portland hospital believing you had a nervous breakdown after your mother's death, Very common, very treatable. Your medical debt will be mysteriously forgiven, and you'll receive a generous settlement from a previously unknown insurance policy. The offer was everything Elena should want. Freedom from the crushing weight that had driven her to this desperate purchase. A chance to rebuild without the constant specter of financial ruin. Yet something in her chest recoiled at the clinical precision of it all. The casual mention of adjusting her memories, like correcting data entry errors. And Dorian? The question escaped before she could stop it. Victoria's mask slipped for just an instant, revealing something cold and hungry beneath the maternal facade. Will remain exactly where Isadora Thorne intended him to stay. Forever. The key in Elena's pocket flared with heat so intense she gasped, and suddenly she could feel Dorian's presence like a living thing, not lurking in shadows but wrapped around her, like armor made of starlight and winter air. His voice reached her through impossible channels, speaking directly to her soul. The choice is yours, Elena. It was always yours. You're lying, Elena said, the certainty surprising her. Not about what he did, maybe that's true, maybe it isn't, but you're lying about helping me. She looked at Victoria's perfect composure, the two men positioned like bodyguards, the expensive equipment visible through the open door. You didn't come here to save some random woman from making a mistake. You've been watching this place, waiting. Victoria's smile grew sharp-edged. Clever girl. Yes, we've been monitoring the situation. The Blackwood incident was contained once. We won't allow it to happen again. What incident? 1723, the accented man supplied. Salem, Massachusetts. Before they managed to bind him to this mountain. 37 dead in a single night. And that was just the beginning. Elena's blood turned to ice, but she forced herself to think past the horror. Salem. The witch trials ended in 1693. The official trials, yes. Victoria's eyes glittered. But magic never truly dies, does it? It simply goes underground, becomes more careful, more desperate. The admission hung in the air like smoke, and Elena realized with crystalline clarity that these people weren't government agents or concerned citizens. They were something else entirely, something that spoke casually of magic and memory adjustment, as if both were scientific facts rather than fairy tale concepts. You're like him, she whispered. Not human. We're human enough, Victoria replied. Just evolved, enhanced. We've spent 3 centuries cleaning up supernatural messes, keeping the world safe from things that should have stayed buried. Her expression hardened. We're very good at what we do, Elena. Very thorough. The threat was implicit, but unmistakable. Elena looked at the open door, at the mist beyond where she could glimpse more figures moving with predatory grace. How many had they brought? How long had they been planning this? Her mother's voice echoed in her memory. Don't let my dying be the end of your living, Mija. But what was living, really? Accepting Victoria's offer meant survival, but it also meant erasure, becoming a carefully edited version of herself, sculpted to fit their idea of acceptable reality. I need you to know something, Elena said, her voice steadier than she felt. I've watched a lot of people die. Cancer doesn't care about your plans or your hopes or your dreams. It just takes and takes until there's nothing left. She met Victoria's gaze directly. I know what it looks like when someone's trying to kill you slowly while telling you it's for your own good. Victoria's maternal mask crumbled entirely. How unfortunate. I had hoped you would be reasonable. The younger man moved toward Elena, his hand disappearing beneath his jacket, but she was already stepping backward into the shadows where Dorian waited. The key in her pocket blazed like a star, and she pulled it free without conscious thought, its metal leaving burns on her palm that felt like baptism by fire. I choose him, Elena said, the words cutting through the cabin's heavy air like a blade. Whatever he's done, whatever he is, I choose to trust someone who told me the truth over people who want to steal my memories and call it salvation. She thrust the burning key toward the shadows, and the world exploded into light. The light wasn't blinding. It was consuming. Elena felt it pour through her like liquid starfire, burning away everything she thought she knew about the world and replacing it with impossible knowledge. The key dissolved in her hand, its metal becoming part of her skin, part of her very bones, and with it came the weight of 3 centuries of imprisonment crashing into her consciousness. She saw Dorian as he truly was, not the shadow-wrapped figure who had spoken to her with careful words, but a being of terrible beauty standing in the epicenter of the storm. His dark hair whipped around a face that belonged in Renaissance paintings, all sharp angles and predatory grace. His eyes held starlight and suffering in equal measure, and when he looked at her, Elena felt the full force of what she had just unleashed. "Foolish girl!" Victoria's voice cut through the maelstrom, but it sounded distant now, muffled by the singing power that filled the cabin. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Elena tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. The knowledge flooding her mind was too vast, too alien. She saw fragments of Dorian's past, not the sanitized version Victoria had presented, but the raw truth of a young man transformed by grief and rage into something monstrous. She felt his first kill, the ecstasy and horror of it, the way blood had tasted like salvation and damnation combined. But she also felt what came after, centuries of regret, of slowly remembering what it meant to be human, of choosing imprisonment over the alternative of becoming a monster again. "Elena." Dorian's voice anchored her, drew her back from the edge of madness. His hand touched her face, and she realized with distant surprise that she was standing, that the light had lifted her from the ground and set her beside him at the cabin's center. "Breathe. Let it settle. Don't try to understand it all at once." She gasped, air flooding her lungs as if she'd been drowning. The visions receded to a manageable whisper, though she could still feel them waiting at the edges of her consciousness. When her vision cleared, she saw that Victoria and her companions had been driven back against the walls, their expensive suits singed by energies that had touched them only tangentially. "The binding is broken," the younger man said, and Elena could hear genuine fear in his voice now. "Completely severed. We need to evacuate." "No." Victoria's command cracked like a whip. "We contain this now, while he's still weak from the transition." She pulled something from her coat, not a weapon, but a crystal that pulsed with sickly green light. 3 centuries of preparation will not be wasted because one traumatized nurse couldn't accept salvation when it was offered. The crystal's light made Elena's newly awakened senses scream warnings. Whatever power it contained was antithetical to the magic that now sang in her blood, designed to sever and destroy rather than bind or contain. She reached for Dorian instinctively, and his hand closed over hers with desperate strength. "A nullification stone," he said, his voice tight with an emotion Elena couldn't identify. "Isadora's final failsafe. They mean to unmake the magic entirely, including what now flows through you." Elena looked down at their joined hands and saw lines of silver light connecting them, pulsing with each heartbeat. The key hadn't just freed Dorian. It had bound them together in some fundamental way, made her part of whatever supernatural ecosystem he inhabited. "Will it kill me?" she asked, surprised by her own calm. "Worse," Victoria answered before Dorian could speak. "It will strip away everything that makes you special, everything that makes you more than merely human. You'll live, but as a hollow shell. We prefer to think of it as necessary surgery." The casual cruelty of it stole Elena's breath. She thought of her mother's final days, how the doctors had presented increasingly invasive treatments as necessary evils, how they'd spoken of quality of life while systematically destroying everything that made life worth living. This felt exactly the same, bureaucratic butchery dressed up as mercy. "There has to be another way," Elena said, looking between Victoria's implacable expression and Dorian's haunted eyes. "Some kind of compromise." "The only compromise," the accented man interrupted, "is whether we drain you both quickly or slowly." But even as he spoke, Elena noticed something the others had missed. The cabin's shadows were moving wrong, flowing like water toward the corners where Victoria's people stood. More concerning, the mist beyond the windows had begun to take shapes, tall figures walking between the trees with purposeful strides. Dorian followed her gaze and smiled for the first time since she'd freed him, though there was no warmth in the expression. "It seems we're not the only ones who've been waiting for this moment," he said softly. "Elena, meet the mountain's other residents. They've been remarkably patient, considering how long Victoria's people have been trespassing on their territory." Victoria spun toward the windows, her face going pale as she realized they were no longer alone. Whatever approached through the mist, it wasn't coming to help her. The figures emerging from the mist moved with liquid grace, their forms shifting between human and something altogether more primal. Elena counted at least a dozen, though the fog made exact numbers impossible to determine. They didn't walk so much as flow through the trees, and wherever their feet touched the ground, the dying autumn vegetation seemed to bloom with renewed life. "Fae," Victoria breathed, her earlier confidence cracking like ice under pressure. The mountain fae. But the treaties were negotiated with Isadora Thorne, Dorian interrupted, his voice carrying new authority now that his bonds were broken. A woman who respected the old ways, who understood that some prices are worth paying for balance. His eyes never left the approaching figures. "You and your organization, however, have spent 3 centuries treating this mountain like your personal laboratory." Elena felt the truth of it through their connection. Glimpses of Victoria's people over the decades, taking samples, setting up monitoring equipment, treating the ancient woods like a resource to be exploited rather than a living entity to be respected. Each intrusion had been small, carefully calculated to avoid triggering major responses, but the accumulated weight of disrespect had not gone unnoticed. The lead figure stepped through the cabin's broken doorway without opening it, passing through the wooden frame like walking through water. Up close, Elena could see that her initial impression of humanity had been generous. This being wore a human shape the way others might wear clothing, a temporary convenience rather than a natural state. Its eyes held the green depth of old-growth forests, and when it spoke, its voice carried the whisper of wind through leaves. "Dorian Blackwood," it said, inclining its head with formal courtesy. "The binding is ended." "By her choice," Dorian replied, his hand tightening protectively on Elena's. "As was promised." "Promised by whom?" Victoria demanded, raising the nullification crystal higher. Its sickly light pulsed faster now, responding to the increased supernatural tension in the room. "The Blackwood Accords clearly state." "The Blackwood Accords," the fey creature said with infinite patience, "were dissolved the moment your people began harvesting dreamroot from our sacred groves without permission. Did you think we wouldn't notice, or did you simply assume we wouldn't care?" Elena felt rather than saw the other fae moving to surround the cabin. They didn't enter, not yet, but their presence pressed against the walls like a gathering storm. Victoria's companions were backing toward each other, their earlier predatory confidence replaced by the sharp-edged panic of predators who had suddenly found themselves prey. "We can negotiate," Victoria said, though her voice lacked its earlier authority. "The Council has resources, connections, whatever grievances you have." 3 centuries of stolen magic," the Fae replied. 47 murdered sprites. 6 dryads whose trees you harvested for your binding circles, its head tilted with bird-like precision. "How does your council propose to resurrect the dead, Victoria Ashford?" The casual use of Victoria's full name sent visible shock across her features. Elena realized that for all their preparation and monitoring, Victoria's people had fundamentally misunderstood the scope of what they were dealing with. They had seen the mountain as a containment site for a single dangerous entity, not as a complex ecosystem where they themselves were the invasive species. "Elena," Dorian said quietly, his thumb tracing over her knuckles in a gesture that felt both comforting and claiming. "We need to leave. Now. What comes next will be justice, but it won't be gentle." She looked at him, seeing past the otherworldly beauty to the genuine concern in his ancient eyes. "Where can we go, if they've been watching this place for centuries?" "They were watching the prison," he corrected, "the cage that Isadora built to contain me. But the cage is broken now, and I am no longer the creature they prepared to fight. His smile was sharp as winter wind. Besides, we won't be traveling alone. The fey creature's attention shifted to Elena with uncomfortable intensity. The key-bearer, it murmured. Isadora's final gambit. Tell me, human child, do you understand what you have accepted? Elena met those forest-deep eyes, feeling the weight of judgment behind them. I understand that everyone keeps asking me that question, instead of just explaining what they mean, she said, exhaustion making her honest. I understand that I was supposed to live a small, manageable life, and instead I've apparently started some kind of supernatural war. And I understand that right now, the only person who's treated me like I have a choice in any of this is Dorian. The Fae's expression shifted, and Elena caught a glimpse of something that might have been approval. Wisdom often wears the mask of ignorance, it said. Very well. We offer safe passage through our realm, but know that accepting means leaving your mortal world behind. There will be no return to the life you knew. Elena thought of her empty apartment, her crushing debts, her job surrounded by death and endings. Then she looked at Dorian, at the silver light still connecting them, at the impossible choice that had somehow become the easiest decision of her life. I've been ready to leave that life behind since the day I bought this cabin, she said. The fey creature nodded once, and the world dissolved. Elena's scream caught in her throat, as reality folded around them like origami made of starlight and shadow. One moment she stood in the familiar decay of her cabin, Victoria's furious shouts echoing off broken walls. The next, she was falling through dimensions that had no names, Dorian's hand the only solid thing in a universe gone liquid. The transition lasted forever, and no time at all. When her feet touched solid ground again, Elena collapsed to her knees, retching violently as her human nervous system tried to process travel through realms it was never meant to experience. The silver grass beneath her hands felt real enough, but it sang when she touched it, harmonies that made her teeth ache. Breathe, Dorian said, crouching beside her. His voice sounded different here, richer, layered with harmonics that spoke directly to her bones. The first crossing is always difficult for mortals. The disorientation will pass. Elena looked up and immediately wished she hadn't. The sky above them wasn't sky at all, but a tapestry of midnight blue shot through with threads of gold that moved like living things. 3 moons hung at different phases, casting overlapping shadows that created pockets of absolute darkness between pools of ethereal light. In the distance, she could see spires that defied physics, twisting upward in spirals that her eyes couldn't quite follow. "Where are we?" she whispered. "The Shadowlands," the fey creature replied. It looked more at home here, its borrowed human form beginning to fray at the edges, revealing glimpses of something vast and vegetal underneath. The between space that touches all worlds. We will rest here while... Its words cut off abruptly, its forest-deep eyes widening with what Elena recognized as alarm. The singing grass fell silent, and somewhere in the impossible distance, a sound like breaking glass echoed across the alien landscape. "They followed us," Dorian said, his voice flat with disbelief. "How is that possible?" The fey creature was already moving, its form shifting into something more tree than humanoid, the nullification crystal. Victoria shattered it during the transition. The backlash tore holes between the realms. Ancient fury cracked through its voice like breaking timber. 40 centuries I have walked these paths, and never has mortal magic caused such violation. Elena struggled to her feet, her legs still unsteady from the crossing. Through their connection, she could feel Dorian's emotions shifting, surprise giving way to something darker, older. The careful control he'd maintained during their conversation at the cabin was beginning to crack, revealing glimpses of the predator beneath. "How long before they reach us?" he asked. "Minutes, perhaps less." The Fae's form solidified again, taking on aspects of warrior as much as forest guardian. "The tears will seal themselves, but not quickly enough. They bring weapons designed for my kind, iron blessed with mortal prayers, fire that burns cold." Elena felt the knowledge flow through her transformed awareness. Victoria's organization hadn't just been monitoring Dorian's prison. They'd been preparing for war against the entire supernatural ecosystem, developing tools specifically designed to kill things that shouldn't be able to die. The nullification crystal had been just one weapon in a vast arsenal built from stolen magic and perverted science. "We could run deeper," Dorian said, but Elena heard the doubt in his voice. "No." The Fae shook its head. "The damage is done. They have our scent now, our magical signature. In this realm they can track us across continents." It looked directly at Elena. "Unless the key-bearer chooses to use what Isadora left her." Elena felt something stir deep in her chest, a presence that hadn't been there before the key dissolved into her bones. It felt vast and patient, like something that had been sleeping for centuries and was only now beginning to wake. "What did she leave me?" Elena asked, though part of her already knew the answer would change everything. "The power to rewrite the rules," Dorian said softly. His eyes held a mixture of awe and terror. Isadora wasn't just a witch, Elena. She was a reality architect, someone who could reshape the fundamental laws of magic itself. That's how she bound me to the mountain, how she created a prison that held for 300 years. "And now that power lives in you," the Fae added. Dormant, but growing stronger with each moment you remain connected to him. It gestured toward the silver thread linking Elena and Dorian. "You could remake the barriers between worlds, seal every passage Victoria's people might use to follow. But the cost would be everything," Elena finished, understanding flooding through her with crystalline clarity. "Using that kind of power would burn away what's left of my humanity. I'd become something else entirely." The sound of breaking glass grew closer, accompanied now by voices shouting in languages that hurt to hear. Victoria and her people were coming, bringing their weapons and their certainty, their absolute conviction that some things were too dangerous to exist. Elena looked at Dorian, seeing her own fear reflected in his ancient eyes. They had minutes to decide between sacrifice and surrender, between transformation and destruction. The choice Isadora had ultimately left her wasn't between saving Dorian or protecting the world. It was between remaining human and becoming something powerful enough to protect them both. The decision tore from Elena's lips before she could stop herself. "I'll do it." "No." Dorian's voice cracked like a whip, his hand crushing hers with desperate strength. "Elena, you don't understand what you're offering to give up. Your humanity isn't just mortality. It's everything that makes you who you are. Your compassion, your capacity for growth, your ability to choose love over power. Isadora tried to warn me about this in her final letter. The magic doesn't just change you, it consumes you." The Fae creature stepped back, its ancient features grave. "He speaks truth. I knew Isadora before her transformation. The woman who created your prison," it said to Dorian, "bore little resemblance to the healer who once tended our sacred groves. Power of that magnitude requires sacrifice of everything soft, everything purely mortal." Elena felt the presence stirring stronger within her chest, responding to her moment of decision. It whispered seductive promises, the ability to reshape reality itself, to make a world where she and Dorian could exist without persecution, where love didn't have to choose between salvation and destruction. But underneath the promises, she sensed something else, a vast, cold hunger that would swallow everything she was and leave behind only the architecture of power. "There has to be another way," she said. But even as the words left her mouth, the sound of approaching footsteps grew closer. Through the dimensional tiers Victoria had carved, she could hear the woman's voice, sharp with command and fury. "Containment Protocol 7. Full suppression. I don't care what realm they've fled to. We end this now." Dorian pulled Elena against him, his body trembling with the effort of restraining instincts 3 centuries old. "I won't let you sacrifice yourself for me. Not when I've lived with the consequences of another woman's transformation for 300 years. His voice dropped to a whisper. "I'd rather face destruction than watch you become what Isadora became." The irony struck Elena like a physical blow. She had found love for the first time in her life, discovered a connection that made her feel truly alive. only to learn that preserving it would cost her everything that made the love possible in the first place. The choice felt designed by some cruel god who delighted in impossible puzzles. "Then what do you suggest?" she asked, though she could already see the answer in his ancient eyes. "I surrender myself to Victoria's people," Dorian said quietly. "Let them complete what Isadora started. The nullification process might destroy me entirely, but at least you would remain." "Absolutely not." Elena's refusal came with surprising force. "I didn't break your prison just to watch you walk into another one." She looked at the fey creature. "How long do we have?" "Moments," it replied, its form already beginning to shift towards something more suited for battle. "I can delay them, but not for long. Their weapons are designed specifically to—" The first of Victoria's people emerged through a tear in reality 30 yards away. Their expensive suits replaced by military tactical gear that hummed with protective enchantments. They moved with practiced efficiency, fanning out to establish a perimeter while more figures poured through the dimensional breach behind them. Victoria herself appeared last, no longer the composed bureaucrat from the cabin. Her hair was wild, her face streaked with blood from glass cuts, and she carried what looked like a weapon designed by committee, part rifle, part ritual implement, all deadly intent. "Stand down," she called across the silver grass, her voice amplified by some technological enhancement. "Dr. Vasquez, you've been exposed to dangerous supernatural influences. We're here to help you." Elena almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Even now, even here, they were maintaining the pretense that this was rescue rather than execution. "What happens if I just refuse?" Elena called back. "If we just say no and walk away?" Victoria's smile was sharp as broken glass. "Then we demonstrate why that's not actually an option." The weapon in her hands began to glow with the same sickly green light as the nullification crystal. But this was clearly a more advanced version, designed for field deployment rather than contained laboratory use. Elena felt it pulling at something deep inside her, trying to drain away the newfound power before she could learn to use it. Around Victoria, her people raised similar weapons, their movements coordinated with military precision. They had done this before, Elena realized. How many other supernatural beings had faced this same choice, surrender or annihilation? "Elena," Dorian whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I brought this upon you." She turned to look at him, memorizing the planes of his face, the genuine anguish in his eyes. 300 years of imprisonment, and he was apologizing to her for finding freedom. "Don't," she said softly. "Don't you dare apologize for being saved." But even as she spoke, Elena felt the cold certainty settling in her bones. They were out of options, out of time, out of miracles. Victoria's weapons were charging. The fey creature was preparing for a battle it couldn't win, and the power inside Elena remained tantalizingly out of reach, available only at a price she couldn't bring herself to pay. For the first time since buying the cabin, Elena faced a problem that love and determination couldn't solve.